The spring dance at Dry Creek should have been full of life. Fiddles scraped against worn strings, boots hammered the floorboards, and laughter rose and fell like waves. But for Maeve Calder, standing alone against the far wall in her plain blue dress, the room felt like a courtroom. Every glance that slid past her was a verdict. Every whispered conversation behind raised hands was a sentence already passed. She kept her hands folded tight at her waist, fingers pressed white against the faded fabric. Her father has been gone for 3 months now. 3 months since the fever took him. 3 months since she'd learned that a name, even a good one, only carried weight as long as the man who built it was still breathing. The Calder Ranch sat on the best water in the county. Everyone knew it. Good grazing land, a strong creek that ran year-round, soil that didn't crack come summer. Her father had carved that place out of nothing, built it with his own hands and a stubbornness that became legend. But legends didn't pay back taxes. Sympathy came cheap in Dry Creek. Help did not. Around her, couples spun and swayed. Girls her age laughed into the shoulders of young ranch hands. Older women clucked and gossiped near the punch table. And Maeve stood there, fading into the wall like a stain no one wanted to acknowledge. She wasn't invisible, that would have been a mercy. She was visible enough to be judged, not visible enough to matter. Widows knew this feeling. So did daughters without protectors. Girls tied to failing land. They all learned the same lesson eventually. A woman alone was a problem the town would rather forget. Maeve forced herself to stay. Leaving early would only confirm what they already believed. That she was finished. That the ranch was as good as sold. That by winter, someone else would be drinking from that creek and working that land, and Maeve Calder would be a name people half remembered when the subject came up over cards. Then she felt it. The weight of eyes that didn't slide away. Sheriff Roland Pike stood near the punch table, silver star polished bright against his vest, hat tilted back just enough to show the gray threading through his hair. He wasn't dancing. He was watching her. And unlike everyone else in that room, he didn't look away when she noticed. He pushed off from the table and crossed the floor with the slow confidence of a man who knew the room would part for him. And it did. Dancers stepped aside without being asked. Conversations paused. Even the fiddler seemed to soften his bow. Pike stopped close. Too close. Near enough that Maeve could smell the tobacco on his breath, see the small satisfaction in his eyes. "You'll lose that ranch by winter," he said. His voice was low, almost kind, the way a man might talk to a horse he was about to put down. "I can make it easier for you. Sell to me now, while you've still got something to sell. Or..." He let the pause stretch. "There are other arrangements we could come to." Maeve's spine went rigid. Her hands tightened until her knuckles ached. "I'll manage." Pike's smile was thin and patient. "You're alone now, Miss Calder." "Alone doesn't manage well out here." She opened her mouth to answer, but the words caught in her throat. Because a shadow fell between them. A man stood there, dusted with trail grime, hat pulled low, coat worn thin at the elbows. He didn't look at the sheriff. He looked at Maeve. And when he spoke, his voice was calm and clear as creek water. "She's taken." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a pause between songs. The kind of quiet that meant everyone was listening now. Pike's smile vanished like smoke. He turned slowly, taking his time, letting the stranger feel the weight of that silver star. "And who are you?" The man met his gaze without flinching. His hand rested easy at his side, not near a gun, but not far either. The kind of stillness that spoke louder than threats. "Name's Jonah Reed." The sheriff studied him. Measured the dust on his boots, the worn grip of his sidearm, the way he stood like a man who'd been tested before and was still standing. Pike's jaw worked for a moment, then he laughed, soft and cold. "Enjoy the dance," he said, and stepped back into the crowd. But the room remembered. Maeve could feel it in the air, thick and watchful. This moment would be discussed tomorrow over coffee, dissected over Sunday dinner, turned into a story before the week was out. Jonah turned to her. Up close, she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the trail dust caught in the creases of his coat. "You all right?" Maeve nodded, though her heart was hammering so hard she thought he must hear it. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He offered his hand anyway. She hesitated. Accepting would mean something. In a town like Dry Creek, everything meant something. But Pike was still watching from across the room, and her father's voice echoed in her memory, "Never let them see you fold." She took his hand. They moved onto the floor as the fiddle picked up again. Jonah danced carefully, like someone more accustomed to horses than people, but his hold was steady and sure. He didn't speak. Didn't ask questions. Didn't offer explanations for why he'd stepped in or who he was or where he'd come from. Maeve was grateful for the silence. Words would have made it real, made it a thing that needed defending or explaining. This way, it was just a dance. Just one moment carved out of a night that had been suffocating her. When the song ended, he released her hand and stepped back with the tip of his hat. "Ma'am." "Thank you," she managed. He nodded once, then turned and walked toward the door. Not hurried, but not lingering either. By the time Maeve gathered herself enough to look for him again, he was gone. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Women gave her curious looks now instead of dismissive ones. Men muttered to each other near the bar. Pike left early, his jaw tight, his star catching lamplight as he pushed through the door. Maeve stayed until it was respectable to leave, then walked home alone under a sky full of stars. The ranch house sat dark and empty on the horizon. Her father's chair still held the shape of him. His coat still hung by the door. The silence there was different from the silence at the dance. This one was full of absence, the kind that pressed on your chest and made breathing feel like work. She lit a single lamp and sat at the kitchen table with the tax notices spread before her. Numbers that wouldn't add up no matter how many times she checked them. Land that was worth everything and could be taken for nothing. A future that narrowed with each passing day. Maeve thought about the stranger. About the way he'd stood between her and Pike without hesitation, without knowing her, without asking for anything in return. She thought about his quiet hands and careful steps and the fact that he'd left before the gossip could start. Strangers passed through Dry Creek all the time. They came and went like the weather. By morning, Jonah Reed would be miles away, and this night would fade into the long list of things that almost mattered. She was sure of it. 2 days later, Maeve found him in her corral. She'd been walking back from the creek with a bucket of water, mind occupied with fence posts that needed replacing and a roof that wouldn't last another hard rain. The sound stopped her cold, a low, soothing voice she didn't recognize, speaking words she couldn't quite make out. She set the bucket down carefully and moved toward the corral fence. Jonah Reed stood in the center, working her father's old gelding. The horse had been favoring its front left leg for a week now, and Maeve hadn't had the time or the knowledge to figure out why. But Jonah had the hoof lifted, fingers moving with practiced gentleness, speaking to the animal like they were old friends sharing secrets. The gelding stood quiet under his touch. Trusting. "I didn't ask for help," Maeve said, keeping the fence between them. Jonah didn't startle. Didn't look up right away. He finished examining the hoof, set it down gently, then straightened and met her eyes. "I know. Your mare's throwing a shoe too. I fixed it." Maeve felt something tight coil in her chest. Pride, maybe. Or fear of what accepting help might cost. "Why are you still here? Seemed like you might need a hand." He moved to the mare, running a palm along her neck. The horse leaned into the touch. "Good animals. They've been working right." My father trained them. Jonah nodded, like that explained everything. He moved with the kind of economy that came from years of hard living, no wasted motion, no flourish. Everything is deliberate. The gelding followed him across the corral without a lead rope, limping less now. Maeve watched him work. He didn't rush. Didn't perform or show off. Just tended to what needed tending. The morning sun caught the dust rising from the corral, turning it gold and soft. You want wages? She asked finally. I want a job, Jonah said. And a place to sleep that isn't a ditch. The practical part of her mind, the part that sounded like her father, ran the numbers. Another mouth to feed. Wages she could barely afford. Risk of depending on someone who might leave the moment something better came along. But the ranch was dying by inches. The barn needed repairs. The fences were failing. The horses needed work she didn't have time for. And Pike was circling like a vulture, waiting for her to stumble. She hired him before pride could stop her. The bunkhouse is empty. Meals with the work. 20 a month if I can make it. Fair enough. That was all. No negotiation, no questions about how long or what exactly he'd be doing. He simply nodded and went back to the gelding, checking the other hooves with the same patient attention. Maeve picked up her bucket and walked toward the house, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her shoulders. She'd just invited a stranger onto her land. A man she'd danced with once and knew nothing about. A man who'd faced down Sheriff Pike without blinking. Her father would have called it foolish. Or desperate. Maybe both. But when she looked back from the porch, she saw Jonah leading the gelding around the corral in a slow circle. The horse moved easier now, head up, trusting those quiet hands. And something in Maeve's chest, something that had been clenched tight since her father's death, loosened just a fraction. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was desperate. But the ranch needed more than her stubbornness to survive. And Jonah Reed worked like a man who understood what it meant to save something worth saving. He stayed. And for the first time in months, Maeve Calder allowed herself to believe that staying might actually be possible. Jonah earned his keep fast. He rose before dawn and worked until the light failed, moving through the ranch like he'd been born to it. He could read weather in the way the wind shifted, mend a fence line so it held strong through winter, and break a horse without breaking its spirit. The animals responded to him with a trust that took Maeve years to build. He had a way about him, quiet, steady, like deep water that ran calm no matter what churned on the surface. He talked little. But when he did, it mattered. The creek's running low, he'd say over morning coffee. We should move the herd to the north pasture. Or, that beam in the barn's rotting through. I can shore it up before it goes. Never more words than necessary. Never advice she didn't need. Just observations that helped her see what she'd been too tired or too overwhelmed to notice. They worked side by side through the long days. Sunburned and sore, hands blistered and backs aching. Maeve learned the rhythm of working with someone again, the way you could communicate with a glance or a nod, how silence between two people could be companionable instead of empty. Jonah didn't ask about her father. Didn't offer pity or platitudes. Didn't treat her like she was fragile or lost. He simply worked, and expected her to do the same. The ranch began to breathe easier for it. Fences got mended. The roof got patched. The horses moved with better training and sold for better prices at the small auctions in town. Maeve still woke up with worry pressing on her chest, still counted coins twice before spending them, still saw the tax deadlines creeping closer. But the panic had dulled to something manageable. Something she could live with. That's when the trouble started. The first sign came on a cool October night. Maeve woke to the smell of smoke and Jonah pounding on her door. They ran together to the barn, buckets in hand, and found the southwest corner ablaze. Not the whole structure, just a corner, like someone had set it deliberately small. A warning, not destruction. They caught it in time to save the stock and most of the structure. But standing there in the ash and dawn light, Maeve felt the message clearly. Someone wanted her to be afraid. Then paperwork went missing from the county office. Records her father had filed, proof of water rights and boundary lines. The clerk apologized, looked genuinely confused, but the documents were gone. A week later, a lien appeared on the ranch. Official looking, stamped and filed. Except Maeve had never signed it. Never borrowed that money. Never agreed to those terms. Sheriff Pike rode by often now. He'd tip his hat from the road, smile that thin smile, and keep riding. Like a man already counting money. Like a man who knew exactly how this story ended. Jonah said nothing about it at first. But Maeve saw the change in him. The way his shoulders stayed tight even when the work was done. How his eyes tracked the road whenever hoofbeats approached. The careful way he positioned himself between her and any stranger who rode up. One evening, after a long day of cutting hay, they sat on the porch with tin cups of coffee. The sun bled red across the horizon, painting the grasslands gold. Beautiful and indifferent. "There's a horse buyer in Cheyenne," Jonah said suddenly. His voice was quiet, measured. "Name's Morrison. Pays fair for good stock. Don't ask questions or play games." Maeve turned to look at him. "That's 3 weeks' travel." "It is. And Pike." "We'll keep squeezing until there's nothing left," Jonah finished. He met her eyes then, and she saw something there she hadn't seen before. Not quite angry. Something colder. Something certain. "This gives you a chance. A real one." Maeve stared into her coffee, watching the steam curl and fade. A cattle drive to Cheyenne. 3 weeks on the trail with winter coming on. Leaving the ranch unprotected. Risking everything on the promise of a fair price from a man she'd never met. It was madness. But staying was a slower death. Pike would keep tightening the noose, burned corners would become burned barns, missing papers would become missing deeds, lines would multiply until the law itself became his weapon. She could fight him here, on ground he controlled, with rules he wrote. Or she could take what mattered most and ride north. "How many horses?" she asked. Jonah's expression didn't change, but something eased in his shoulders. 6. Your best stock. The roan mare, the 2 geldings with the good gaits, the paint that's green broke but smart. Leave the old ones and the young ones here. Take waddles, sell high enough to clear your debt and then some. That's most of what we have. It's enough to matter." He set his cup down. "Morrison knows quality when he sees it. Your father trained these horses right. They'll speak for themselves." Maeve thought about her father. About the years he'd spent building something from nothing, the calluses on his hands, the pride in his voice when a horse he'd trained went for a good price. This ranch was his legacy. But legacies didn't mean much if they were stolen. "When?" she asked. "Before dawn tomorrow. Before Pike knows we're gone." The speed of it stole her breath. But Jonah was right. Waiting would only give Pike time to act. Time to file more false claims, to pressure more officials, to turn the screws tighter. Surprise was the only advantage they had. "All right," she said. "We go." They spent the night preparing. Maeve packed saddlebags with supplies, flour, coffee, dried beef, matches, blankets. Everything they'd need for 3 weeks on the trail. Jonah checked tack and shoes, selecting gear that would hold up under hard use. They worked in near silence, the lamplight casting long shadows across the barn. At one point, Maeve paused, looking around at the place her father had built. The stalls he'd hammered together, the tools he'd hung on the walls, the smell of hay and leather and honest work. Leaving felt like abandonment. He'd understand, Jonah said quietly. He stood in the doorway, reading her face like he'd read the weather. Sometimes holding on means knowing when to move. Maeve nodded, not trusting her voice. They left before the sun touched the horizon. 6 horses on lead ropes, everything they owned tied to saddles, the ranch house standing dark and empty behind them. Maeve didn't look back. Looking back would make her hesitate, and hesitation could break her resolve. The trail north was hard from the start. The first day brought rain that soaked through their coats and turned the ground to mud. The horses picked their way carefully, heads down against the wind. Maeve's hands ached from gripping reins, her legs cramped from hours in the saddle. But they pushed on. The second night, they made camp in a shallow draw. Jonah built a small fire and heated coffee while Maeve tended the horses. The animals huddled together against the cold, steam rising from their backs. "Storm's coming," Jonah said, studying the sky. "Big one. We'll need to find shelter tomorrow." Maeve wrapped her hands around the tin cup, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. "How far have we come?" "Far enough that Pike can't catch us easily." He poked at the fire. "Not far enough to rest yet." She understood. They were committed now. No turning back. The only way out was through. The storm hit on the third day, fierce and unforgiving. Wind drove the rain sideways, stinging like needles against exposed skin. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, and thunder rolled across the plains like cannon fire. The horses fought their lead ropes, eyes rolling white with fear. One of the geldings, the gray with the steady gait, spooked hard at a lightning strike that hit too close. He reared and pulled free, bolting into the storm-dark grassland. Jonah went after him on foot, disappearing into the rain before Maeve could protest. She held the remaining horses, speaking low and steady even as her own fear threatened to choke her. Minutes stretched like hours. The storm screamed around her, trying to tear everything loose. Then Jonah emerged from the gray wall of rain, the gelding's rope wrapped around his hand, both of them soaked through and breathing hard. He said nothing, just tied the horse back into the string and kept moving. They found shelter finally in an abandoned homestead, 3 walls and part of a roof, but enough to break the wind. They huddled there with the horses, waiting for the storm to pass. Water dripped through holes in the roof. The cold settled deep into Maeve's bones. "Drink this," Jonah said, pressing a cup of whiskey into her shaking hands. He'd produced it from somewhere in his saddlebag. She drank. The burn helped. The days that followed blurred together. Cold mornings when frost made the grass crunch underfoot. Long hours in the saddle, watching the horizon for trouble. Nights so cold that sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the need to keep the fire going, to check on the horses, to simply survive until dawn. One of the horses went lame, a stone bruise that wouldn't heal fast enough. They had to rest an extra day, precious time bleeding away while Maeve worried about Pike discovering their absence, about winter catching them on the trail, about arriving in Cheyenne too late. Jonah worked the lame horse with patient hands, speaking those same soft words that seemed to reach something animal and true. By morning, the horse was moving better. "We'll take it slow," he said. "Pushing hard will only make it worse." There were moments when Maeve's hands shook too badly to hold the reins. Exhaustion and cold and the weight of everything. Jonah walked then, leading her horse while she slumped in the saddle, too tired to be ashamed. They talked during those long miles. Real talk, not the surface pleasantries of the ranch. Jonah told her about the places he'd been, railheads and mining camps, cattle drives and broken dreams. About how drifting was easier than staying because leaving meant never having to watch something die slow. "Why'd you stop?" Maeve asked one evening. "In Dry Creek. You could have kept riding." Jonah was quiet for a long moment, feeding small sticks into the fire. "Saw you standing there at that dance. Saw how they looked right through you. And I thought, I know what that feels like. Being invisible. Being counted as nothing. He glanced at her. Figured maybe this time I'd stay long enough to matter. Maeve felt something shift in her chest. Not the sudden spark of romance from stories, but something deeper. Recognition. The understanding that came from shared weight, from walking the same hard road together. You matter, she said quietly. The fire crackled between them. Overhead, stars spread across the sky like scattered diamonds, cold and distant and beautiful. By the time they reached the outskirts of Cheyenne 2 weeks after leaving Dry Creek, they were dirty, exhausted, and bound together by something stronger than words could capture. The city rose before them, wooden buildings and muddy streets, the promise of civilization and fair dealing. Maeve straightened in her saddle, gathering herself. This was it. Everything depended on what happened next. Morrison's stable sat on the north edge of Cheyenne, a solid structure that smelled of good hay and honest work. The man himself came out when they rode up, tall, weathered, with eyes that assessed the horses before acknowledging the riders. Jonah Reed, he said, recognition in his voice. Been a while. It has. Jonah dismounted, shaking the man's hand. Brought you quality stock. Ladies' ranch, good bloodlines, trained right. Morrison walked the line of horses slowly, running his hands over legs and shoulders, checking teeth and hooves. He didn't rush. Didn't speak. Just examined each animal with the careful attention of a man who knew his trade. Maeve held her breath. Everything rested on this moment. The ranch, her future, her father's legacy. 6 horses against a mountain of debt. Finally, Morrison stepped back and named a price. It was fair. More than fair. Enough to clear the debt completely and leave something over for winter supplies. Maeve felt the words hit her like a physical thing, relief so intense it made her dizzy. Deal, she managed. They completed the transaction in Morrison's office. He counted out the money in gold and silver coins, the sound of it clinking onto the desk impossibly real. Maeve's hands trembled as she signed the papers, as she scooped the money into a leather pouch that suddenly weighed more than anything she'd ever carried. Good horses speak for themselves, Morrison said, nodding to her. Your father trained them? He did. It shows. You ever have more, you bring them here. I'll buy them. Outside, Maeve stood in the afternoon sun with the money pouch pressed tight against her chest. Jonah waited nearby, giving her space for whatever she was feeling. We did it, she whispered. You did it, he corrected. Good horses. Good training. That was all your father's work. And yours. They spent that night in a boarding house, the first real beds they'd slept in since leaving Dry Creek. Maeve lay awake in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the city beyond her window. She thought about the debt, about to be paid. About Pike's face when he discovered his schemes had failed. About the ranch, waiting for her return. About Jonah, in the room next door, who'd walked miles so she could ride. Who'd chased a spooked horse into a storm. Who'd chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. They left Cheyenne 2 days later with winter supplies loaded on pack horses, flour, coffee, sugar, nails, tools, everything they'd need to make it through the cold months. Maeve also carried receipts. Official papers proving the debt was paid. Proof that Pike's liens and claims were lies. The ride home felt different. Lighter, despite the loaded packs. The land didn't seem as harsh. The cold didn't bite as deep. They made better time, moving with purpose instead of desperation. When Dry Creek finally appeared on the horizon, Maeve felt her stomach tighten. Pike would be waiting. He wouldn't have stayed idle during their absence. There would be consequences for defying him, for succeeding where he'd expected her to fail. But she had proof now. And witnesses. And Jonah had been quietly collecting names during their time on the ranch, men Pike had threatened, deals he'd forced, corruption that ran deep but quiet through the county. They rode into town together just after noon. People stopped to stare. Maeve Calder, who was supposed to be finished. Who was supposed to have lost everything by now. She sat straight in her saddle, the pouch of receipts secure in her coat, and looked them all in the eye. Sheriff Roland Pike stood outside his office, a silver star catching the winter sun. His expression darkened when he saw them. Saw that they'd returned. Saw that they'd survived. Maeve dismounted slowly. "Sheriff. We need to talk about those liens you filed." Pike's smile was thin and dangerous. "Don't know what you mean, Miss Calder." "I think you do." Maeve pulled the receipts from her coat, unfolding them carefully. "Debts paid. In full. And I have witnesses in Cheyenne who'll testify to the sale. Which means those liens you filed. The ones I never signed. They're frauds." The street had gone quiet. People gathered on porches and in doorways, watching. This was the kind of moment Dry Creek would talk about for years. Pike's hand moved toward his star, a gesture of authority. But Jonah stepped forward then, positioning himself at Maeve's shoulder. Not threatening. Just a present. A reminder that she didn't stand alone. "There's more," Jonah said quietly. "Names. Dates. Men you've pressured. Property you've seized under false pretenses. I've been talking to people, Sheriff. People who were too scared to speak up before. They're not scared anymore." Pike's face went red, then white. His jaw worked like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Around them, the crowd shifted. Murmured. Some nodded. The county clerk stepped forward, the same man who'd lost Maeve's paperwork. "I kept copies," he said, voice shaking but steady. "Of everything that went missing. I knew something wasn't right." One by one, others came forward. A rancher Pike had forced to sell low. A widow who'd lost her home to a lien she'd never signed. A merchant named Pike had threatened to sell to the wrong people. The stories poured out, quiet and damning. Pike's corruption came apart in the afternoon sun. Ugly and public. The kind of unraveling that couldn't be stopped once it started. By spring, he was stripped of his badge. By summer, he was hauled east in irons, cursing everyone who'd finally said no. The town watched it happen the same way they'd watched Maeve fade against that dance hall wall, with judgment and silence. But this time, the silence meant something different. The ranch stood. Maeve worked it through the winter with Jonah at her side. They mended the barn, reinforced the fences, and trained the new foals born in the spring. The land responded to their care, green and alive as the seasons turned. But when the snow melted and the creek ran high, Jonah packed his bedroll. Maeve found him in the barn, tying his gear with the same careful attention he gave everything. Her heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "You're leaving." "It's what I do," he said, not looking at her. "Stay too long, and I start feeling trapped. Start remembering why I left the last place." "I know." She did. She'd always known. Jonah Reed was a drifter. It was in his bones the same way this land was in hers. He hesitated then, hands stilling on the rope. When he finally looked at her, something raw and uncertain showed in his eyes. "I could learn," he said quietly. "If you'd have me. Not as a hand. As something more. Someone who stays." Maeve looked at him, this man who'd faced down Pike without flinching, who'd walked miles so she could ride, who'd chosen this hard place and harder work when he could have chosen ease. She thought about the land, scarred and stubborn and alive. About how some things were worth the fear of staying. "Home," she said. Jonah smiled, small and real. "Good. I'm tired of running. He set the bedroll down. This time, when he reached for her, it wasn't to dance. It was to pull her close, to hold her like something precious finally found. And when the town looked at Maeve Calder now, they saw a woman who'd claimed her place, not through rescue, but through choice. She'd stood. And someone had chosen to stand with her. That made all the difference. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the Wild West where courage, love, and justice always find their way. Drop a comment below, which moment moved you the most? Was it when Jonah first stepped in, or when he chose to stay? We read every single one. Thanks for riding along with Maeve and Jonah's journey. Until the next story, keep believing that the bravest choice is always to stand your ground.